Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Andrew Jackson, and the focus is on his own responsibility. The year is 1817, a couple of years removed from Jackson's big heroics at the Battle of New Orleans. As the War of 1812 had come to an end a couple of years prior. A new boss is in the White House now for Jackson, who stayed in the Army as a major general, but now it's James Monroe as the commander-in-chief. Had just become President of the United States, the former Secretary of State and acting Secretary of War. And a lot of eyes, both for the Army and the administration, were on the American southern border, where challenges with Indian incursions against American settlers was continuing. The latest blow-up was in an Indian community called Fowleton, which the American soldiers eventually captured and burned to the ground. The Indians decided to retaliate. They attacked an American supply ship, massacred 40 American soldiers, their wives and children, and again, up in arms now, the United States about what to do about this. Part of the problem is that these Indian incursions were coming from Spanish-held Florida, where the Indians would hide out, they would come into the United States, take their actions, and then go back into Florida, where the Spanish, who owned Florida, were doing nothing to police their territory, and so it was a perfect hideout and escape route for these Indians. The Monroe administration decided to change the orders for the American soldiers. And in retaliation for this recent massacre and to put a stop to all of this, if you need to go into Florida to go after these Indians, you have permission to do so. But Secretary of War John Calhoun's directions to General Edmund Gaines were very clear. You can do that, but don't attack the Spanish. We are not at war with Spain, so if you come upon a Spanish-held fort or town, maybe they're even hiding Indians in there, you are not authorized to attack. You need to contact us for further information. Well, General Gaines was actually on another assignment at the time that these orders came in, so they went to the next in command, which was Major General Andrew Jackson. And Jackson actually didn't believe these orders went far enough, and he decided on his own to write a letter to the President of the United States, and he said to James Monroe that the whole of East Florida should be seized and held as an indemnity for the outrages of Spain upon the property of our citizens. He then continued, "Let it be signified to me through any channel, say Mr. J. Ray, Congressman John Ray of Tennessee, that the possession of the Floridas would be desirable to the United States, and in 60 days it will be accomplished." Jackson was clear on what he wanted. The question was, how would the president respond? Well, the president never saw this letter. He was ill at the time, and it was passed along to Secretary of War Calhoun. Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford saw the letter. Neither acted on it, neither provided any feedback or guidance or authority to General Jackson, and that matter was left aside. Jackson had his orders. He had 3,000 soldiers plus 1,000 friendly Indians all ready to fight on his side, and he was ready to take the fight into Florida, which is exactly what he did. He laid waste to one Indian village after another, killing, capturing, burning. From a military standpoint, against the Indians, this was a complete success. But Jackson wasn't done. He didn't think the mission and his orders went far enough, and he'd been known to be insubordinate in the past, take matters into his own hand, and he was about to do that again. This probably shouldn't have been a surprise. This was Jackson's modus operandi multiple times throughout his career. In fact, at one point, he had written a note to his former governor of Tennessee, William Blount, where he said, clearly, there are times when it is highly criminal to shrink from responsibility or scruple about the exercise of our powers. There are times when we must disregard punctilious etiquette and think only of serving our country. In Jackson's mind, if he had to disobey orders for the greater good of his country, the end justifies the means. He was going to do it. He had done it in the past, and he's going to do it again. Now, as an aside, one can imagine what he would have thought if one of his subordinates had said something like this. It might have been a duel or a fight to the death, but that was not the case when Jackson was making these decisions. So, what did he do? He took the fight to the Spanish. A Spanish fort, St. Mark's in Florida. He went and captured it. Then there was the larger town of Pensacola, where the leaders of Spanish-held territory came out to, look, we are not at war with the United States. Why are you coming after us, General Jackson? And General Jackson couldn't be bothered. Spanish were guilty. They were supporting the Indians in his mind, gave him every right to go and attack Pensacola, which he did. He garrisoned the town, and he was ready to leave to go back to Tennessee. But there were a couple of other things that he did along the way. It wasn't just the Spanish that he attacked. He captured 2 British citizens during all of these battles, one by the name of Alexander Arbuthnot. Arbuthnot was a Scottish trader who Jackson accused of aiding and abetting the Indians. Then there was a British Marine, a former British Marine by the name of Robert Ambrister. He was also captured, charged with the same offense, aiding and abetting the Indians. A military tribunal was held. The court decided that these men were guilty, they were convicted, and they were sentenced, one to death, and in the case of Ambrister, originally sentenced to death, but then they changed it. 50 lashes and a year of hard labor. That was the recommendation that went to General Jackson, and General Jackson said, you know what? No, we're going back to the death sentence. Both are to be executed, and they were. With this, Jackson's job was essentially done, and he thought things had gone quite well. In fact, he said, in all things, I have consulted public good and the safety and security of our southern frontier. I have established peace and safety and hope the government will never yield it. Well, that government had a very different interpretation of what Jackson had done. In fact, they were in an uproar as they believed Jackson had committed acts of war against Spain, possibly Britain, not only without authority, but against orders from the executive branch, and certainly without authority, which the Constitution demanded, and for acts of war by Congress, certainly not a factor. John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, was the only member of the cabinet that actually supported Jackson. He described the actions this way. The president and all the members of the cabinet, except myself, are of opinion that Jackson acted not only without, but against his instructions, that he has committed war against Spain. The question is embarrassing and complicated, not only as involving an actual war with Spain, but that of the executive power to authorize hostilities without a declaration of war by Congress. This was a big mess in Washington that Jackson had created. Well, the first orders from President Monroe to his Secretary of State Adams was go deal with the Spanish and go deal with the British, which Adams did quite well. He was firm. The towns were immediately returned. The fort was immediately returned to the Spanish, but they were kind of put on warning. Don't let this happen again, but we admit as a country we went a little too far here, and so we're going to give you back your towns, but don't try complaining very much because you were actually kind of culpable in this in the whole mess anyway. The more difficult diplomatic job actually President Monroe took upon himself, and it had nothing to do with Spain, it had nothing to do with the British, it had to do with how do you rebuke General Andrew Jackson, a man who usually, if he was rebuked or something called into question, he was quick to challenge to a duel or to take offense or to come back at you even harder. That was Jackson's modus operandi, and now the question was, how is Monroe going to do this? And so he took a few weeks before he finally wrote Jackson a very carefully worded letter. He was firm in his outset, where he said, in calling you into active service against the Seminoles and communicating to you the orders which had been given just before to General Gaines, the views and intentions of government were fully disclosed in respect to the operations in Florida. In transcending the limit prescribed by those orders, you acted on your own responsibility. There was the rebuke. You went beyond your orders. Now, the rest of his letter was actually praiseworthy of Jackson, understanding his motives, his patriotism, why he did what he did, but nevertheless, Jackson had been rebuked. This was not something that Jackson normally would take sitting down, and he did not in this case, although it wasn't a challenge to a duel, it was in the form of a letter back to his president. Jackson wrote, "How then can it be said with propriety that I have transcended the limits of my orders or acted on my own responsibility? My order was as comprehensive as it could be and contained neither minute original instructions nor a reference to others previously given to guide and govern me. The fullest discretion was left with me in the selection and application of means to effect the specified legitimate objects of the campaign, and for the exercise of a sound discretion on principles of policy am I alone responsible." He's saying basically, I didn't go against any orders. I don't know what you're talking about. I did my job and I did it well. Well, Monroe and Jackson actually traded several letters back and forth, neither one giving ground, both trying to be respectful of the other. But eventually, Monroe decided to let the matter drop, and he stopped responding to the letters. And they were going to let bygones be bygones and let things lie. Congress, however, also got into this mix. In particular, Henry Clay from Kentucky was appalled that Jackson would take these actions on his own without orders and certainly without sanction from Congress. Clay pursued a censure motion against General Jackson, which did not pass in the United States Congress, but boy, Jackson was angry about it and something he would never forget in his enmity for Henry Clay. Well, there were cutbacks in the U.S. military now after the War of 1812. President Monroe was in charge, and he decided to scale the military back to have only one major general left in the regular army. Jackson did not have seniority, and so rather than be demoted, he decided to resign. June 1st, 1821, his health was poor. He had longed to go home with his wife Rachel, and that's exactly what he did. But President Monroe had one more task for him. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams had negotiated the acquisition of Floridas from Spain by this point. Finally, this was going to be resolved, and the United States had possession of the Spanish-held Floridas. And Monroe asked Jackson one more job: to go be the first civilian governor of Florida of the territory and oversee the transfer of power from the Spanish to the Americans. And so Jackson agreed. He and Rachel made their way to Spanish-held Florida, where the transition of power, the Spanish flag came down, the American flag went up. Very proud moment for Jackson. He had been working for this in one way or another for many, many years from a military standpoint, so certainly a point of pride as he had the opportunity to oversee the transition and start putting in an American administration to govern the territory of Florida. But of course, nothing goes easily with Andrew Jackson, and there were some disputes, and Colonel Jose Calleva was the Spanish representative from the king, still in the area, kind of overseeing the transition, and there was some conflict about some papers that were in Calleva's hands, and Jackson ordered them to be brought to him, and he initially demurred. So what did Jackson do? He ordered Calleva brought to him. They got in a shouting match, and he put him in prison. This is sort of an ugly moment in Jackson's brief tenure as governor. It was one of the things Jackson realized at this point was, look, I'm done with this. I've done my duty. I did what the president asked me to do. 4 months into his tenure as the governor of the territory of Florida, he decides to resign. He says, I am truly wearied of public life. I want rest, and my private concerns imperiously demand my attention. He had every intention of retiring, going with Rachel back to the Hermitage, and retiring from public life. But his country wasn't done with him yet, and that's the story for another day. That is Andrew Jackson, and on his own responsibility. From the life of Andrew Jackson. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.